Hello, welcome to this WSD.Tech regulatory update on the new Regulatory Technical Standards, or RTS, under the EU PRIIPs regulation, which were published by the European Commission on September 7. With this short video, we want to bring you up to speed on the key changes of the new RTS compared with the draft RTS that were published by the European Supervisory Authorities, or ESAs, in March of this year. First of all, the good news for those who've been following the evolution of the RTS over the past year or so is there are no substantive changes from the March version. So in case you've already done an analysis of that version or made any decisions, you don't have to revisit that. Another point worth noting is that the compliance date has been pushed back to July 1, 2022. This was expected, although some were hoping that the date would be pushed back even further to January 1, 2023, so that the new RTS would get wrapped up with the Level 1 review that the European Commission will conduct next year. That's not the case, so there's now a possibility that manufacturers will have to implement the new RTS and then have to make further changes down the road if and when the regulation itself gets amended. For UCITS funds and AIFs, this is likely going to be a bigger problem than for manufacturers of structured products, since this will be the first time they're going to have to comply. A couple more housekeeping items. The new RTS have been published in a format that some people may find a bit hard to read, because instead of simply restating the old RTS, they amend individual paragraphs, and so you have to read the old and the new RTS side by side to figure out what's going on. To make this a bit easier at WSD, we've prepared a convenience blackline that pinpoints the changes, which you can download from our website, WSD.Tech. Also, some manufacturers have expressed a desire to discuss the new RTS in a wider forum, to ensure that the rules are interpreted and applied consistently across the EU, so that investors in different member states receive similar disclosure, which is one of the key objectives of the PRIIPs regulation. So as in 2018, I will, together with Ayal Leibowitz from LPA, host a forum that will give everyone an opportunity for discussion. If you're interested but haven't signed up yet, you can send either of us an email. My email address is shown below. In the rest of this video, I'm going to quickly touch on the most important changes brought about by the new RTS. The biggest change is probably the treatment of autocallables and potentially issuer callable products. I say potentially because there was a slight ambiguity in the March version, which unfortunately the final version has not addressed. Basically, the scenarios table for these products has been changed such that the final column no longer shows the outcome at the end of the recommended holding period, but upon termination of the product, regardless of whether that termination is because the product has run all the way to maturity or has been redeemed early. So if under a given scenario, the product terminates at or before the end of an intermediate holding period, for example at the 1-year point, no figures are shown for that period or any subsequent period, and instead the return to the investor is displayed in the final column of the table. This means you could end up with a table where some cells remain empty. The bigger question though is that the idea that you can trace an early redemption to an individual path of the simulation is inconsistent with the way the scenarios were calculated under the old RTS. As you can imagine, this has opened a Pandora's box of questions, from how manufacturers can ensure that the scenarios for products with an early redemption feature make sense, to whether the old way of calculating the scenarios still applies. The new RTS also state that manufacturers should include a brief explanation of the scenarios, which can be up to 300 characters long. It will be interesting to see how this requirement will be interpreted, particularly in light of the UK FCA's recent PRIIP Kits consultation, which goes a step further and proposes the abolishment of the quantitative scenarios in favor of only a narrative explanation. A second group of changes concerns costs. Similar to the revised format for the scenarios table for autocallables and potentially issuer callable products, there's now a separate table for costs over time that applies only to these types of products. The new rules are also more explicit on distribution fees. Where applicable, manufacturers must include an explicit warning right below the costs over time table that they may share a portion of the entry costs with the distributor. They also must disclose the maximum distribution fee that may be charged. Another area of big changes concerns the treatment of Category 2 PRIIPs for purposes of the scenarios table. While the reason for these changes is that UCITS and AIFs will become subject to the PRIIP Kits regime from July 1, 2022 for the first time, they also affect manufacturers of structured products that qualify as Category 2 PRIIPs. Under the new RTS, the scenarios for Category 2 PRIIPs are no longer statistical scenarios based on a bootstrapping simulation of the reference asset. Instead, they are derived directly from the historical performance of the reference asset over the past 10 years, or if longer, the recommended holding period plus 5 years. Specifically, what happens is the reference asset's performance over different subperiods is calculated, and the worst, median, and best performance is then used as the basis for the figures shown in the scenarios table. Under the old RTS, the scenarios for Category 2 PRIIPs were calculated using the Cornish-Fisher expansion. It turns out that as far as products with a linear payoff are concerned, this methodology leads to very similar results as the bootstrapping simulations required for Category 3 PRIIPs. In other words, under the old rules, it didn't matter where exactly the line was drawn between Category 2 PRIIPs and Category 3 PRIIPs. That's no longer the case under the new rules. In other words, where a product falls into Category 2 or 3 is now an important question. The fact that the scenario outcomes for the two types of PRIIPs can be quite different also means that economically very similar products that fall on different sides of the boundary, such as Delta 1 trackers on the one hand and trackers with a very low floor or a very high cap, can attract very different scenarios. Finally, the new rules give manufacturers a lot more discretion. Manufacturers can increase the SRI if they believe that it would otherwise not adequately reflect the risks of a product. They can choose lower percentiles for the performance scenarios if they think there's a material risk that investors might otherwise form inappropriate expectations about the possible returns of the product. And they may omit intermediate holding periods. While increased flexibility for manufacturers is a good thing, it also risks creating divergence in the market and ultimately confusion on the part of investors. What about exchange-traded products? Should their SRI be raised to 7 to bring them in line with OTC derivatives? What about products linked to highly volatile underlyings, or barrier products that may oscillate between two risk classes? What about gap notes, or reverse convertibles linked to interest rates? As these examples show, more flexibility isn't necessarily a good thing unless manufacturers in different EU member states interpret the rules consistently. And that brings me back to the forum I mentioned at the beginning of this video. If you'd like to participate in the forum and learn more about the new RTS, please drop me an email. We'll hold our first meeting on September 22 at 10 AM London time. That's it for today. I hope you enjoyed this brief update, and I look forward to seeing you at the forum.